Oh, greetings, stranger. Can I interest you in some arm blades? Totally legal, of course. Personally, I tend to think of forearm-mounted weapons as somewhat devious and associate them with rogues, but they're quite common in fantasy. You see them in the hands or in the arms of superheroes. Wolverine comes to mind, obviously, and others. Gladiators, of course, barbarians are often shown, and feral beast, lizard men, and things like that tend to be shown with forearm blades or claws or spikes or things of that nature. We're looking for real-life historical examples of this concept. There isn't a whole lot. The only things I can think of are the Roman scissor, which is a gladiator weapon, the Indian Katar and its cousin, so to speak, the Pata, aka sword gauntlet, and that's about it. And those are different because they aren't actually strapped to the arm, but they are held by a grip. Although the pata has a curved metal bar that the arm slips through, so arguably that counts as attached to the arm. A katar is basically a form of push dagger, and you really wield it by the grip that goes perpendicular to the blade, the same way as the scissor and the pata. They also have a perpendicular grip inside that you hold on to, so they're not actually strapped. Sometimes you can find shields or bucklers with spikes or blades attached, although those are rare too. The lantern shield comes to mind. That one is quite a freak anyway. It's a combination of all kinds of unusual components, features, however you want to look at it. This wasn't very common, which is kind of odd. You could easily attach a blade to a sword or buckler. In parts of India, there are some rare examples of this, particularly if you want to count the Madhu, which is really more of a double-ended horn dagger that may or may not have a buckler attached to it. In Europe, on the other hand, oddly enough, I found more shields with gun barrels attached rather than blades. Marozzo's Imbracciatura is one such example, and I found two others which we'll return to later. This one I'm just cheating, by the way, just for visual aid. Obviously, I haven't seen every weapon made in the history of humanity on the entire planet. Nobody has. And maybe some of you can think of real-life examples that are closer to the fantasy arm claws or blades or whatever. But either way, so what are the pros and cons of this? This, by the way, is not really the greatest choice. You would be generally better off with a straight double-edged blade, but this is the blade of the only sword I currently have that can be disassembled. I should have made this video back when I still had that custom-made scissor, which again is not technically strapped to the arm, but rather held by a grip. Either way, it would have been good for visual reference, so we're just gonna have to make do with what I've got here. So let's start with the pros. There are some definite advantages of having the blade aligned, in line with your forearm, because this allows for a very powerful thrust. This way you can really put your body weight into it and drive it, which of course you can anyway. This is what you're supposed to do no matter how you thrust, really. But in this case, because you don't have to worry about the alignment of your wrist stays straight. This is a nice, direct, solid structure, very efficient. With a weapon that's held in the opposite orientation, you always have the issue with a forward thrust. In order to actually align it with the direction of the thrust, you have to either bend your wrist and overextend it unnaturally, which is not as efficient and can cause injury, or you have to change your grip and put a finger over the guard so that you tilt it more forward and now it's aligned better. There is of course nothing wrong with a thrust like this, but this is just a little bit more efficient due to the alignment. Another benefit is it's a rigid structure, so there's actually less risk for injury, and by that I mean self-injury. Because with a sword, if you do it incorrectly, if you try to decelerate and stop a sword cut, especially with a heavier sword, and you allow your wrist to collapse and overextend, and then you're absorbing all of that force with your wrist, that's no good. So that can happen here because your wrist is perfectly straight. So it also requires less technique. In that sense, it's easier. And depending on the design, it's pretty much impossible to be disarmed. You know, if you think of a scissor or a pata, it's really not happening. If it's strapped to the arm, if it's done securely, and that's another issue that we'll get to later, then that also shouldn't be a problem. Another advantage is, as you've already seen, you can hold onto things at the same time. So if you really wanted to, you could dual. Does it count as dual wielding? Either way, you could use a shorter wrist blade together with a sword if you wanted to. And generally that hand is available. It's of course limited because it's locked in a certain position, but you can grab with it more easily than if you also have a sword handle. You can still obviously use your fingers. You can hold on to more than one thing at a time, of course, but the problem is it makes your grip a lot weaker. When it comes to cuts, it depends on the angle. Some work better than others. This right here, upper left to lower right, diagonal downward cut, no problem at all. This is perfectly aligned, and in fact this is very powerful because you can rotate your body into it. Think of it like a hammer fist in unarmed martial arts. That's fine. Anything from left to right, basically. You know, a horizontal cut, again, no problem. Rising cut, lower left to upper right, again, nicely aligned. Right to left with the true edge, big problem. This basically doesn't really work. This is so awkward. Horizontal, forget it. Rising cut, completely out. With a single-edged blade. If this was double-edged, no problem. Because if this is double-edged, then you can do this. And then it's fine. Then it is well aligned. You can do this, you can do that, you can do a rising cut as well. With a false edge, no problem at all. So if it's double-edged, you have every angle available that you could want. Okay, what about defense? Cut to the upper left opening. You can't do a hanging parry. That's just, with this, not really happening. I mean, you kind of can, assuming that this is armored, you know, like with a pata, for example, something like that. You could do that, but then you're very, very close. So the better way to defend against this would be to just, you know, cut into it and move it over there. Horizontal, you have to, again, cut into it. Boom. Basically, think of this like a krumpau, because that's essentially the same movement. So you need to really aggressively strike this down, otherwise it's not going to work. The only other way would be to just change the orientation of your body. If you lower yourself, you could potentially do it like this. So that's a bit awkward. Rising cut to the lower left opening. Again, same idea, you know, basically krumpau with a longsword. So cutting into it. But that works, and then you also get it out of the way. Let's raise that a little bit higher so you can see better here. So that's, and this is a good situation to be in. So if you can manage to move it over here, now there's the opening as well. So that works quite well. Upper right opening, no problem. This is easy. Horizontal, you have to kind of either lower yourself or, again, catch it like this. If you want to catch it on the flat, then you would have to do it like this, which is a little bit awkward. And lower right opening, that's easy enough. Thrusts, of course, boom, either like this or like that. What about the drawbacks? For one, the downside of the stabilization is that you don't have the options that you have if you can freely move your wrist. There are a number of techniques that you can use. For example, a quick wrist cut where you tense your fingers and snap the wrist forward. That's not really much of a thing here. Like, you can kind of twitch your forearm forward, but you do not have this action here. You have a lot more angles available. For example, like I mentioned, the hanging guard that you can use with a sword is not an option like this. Plus, while there are a variety of grappling techniques against swords, they're potentially worse with this. Because with the sword, let's say somebody got a hold of the blade and is using the blade's leverage against you to pry it out of your hand. It's of course not good to be disarmed, obviously. But if you let go, you can still fight. If somebody gets a hold of this, they've now got you in a joint lock. You cannot release. If they grapple you, there's no way to escape. Think of it this way. Having a weapon solidly fixed to your limb could in some situations turn being disarmed into having a bone broken or a joint dislocated. In an elbow lock, the forearm is used for leverage against you. If you have a blade, spike, or claws attached to your arm, now that adds to the length of the lever, so the force acting on your arm is multiplied. The next disadvantage is that they are not exactly quick to deploy. If you actually have to strap it to your arm, then you can't just wear it on your belt and just draw it quickly in case you need to. This applies to an extent as well to things like the pata or scissor. The latter, of course, wasn't designed to be carried for self-defense and quickly drawn. If you actually have to slip into it, it's a bit more finicky than just grabbing a hold of a sword or dagger blade. And if you have an entire gauntlet or forearm guard attached to it, it's also awkward to carry. Like, even if you have a sheath on your belt for the blade, and you've got this whole thing sticking out. What about a design like the Katar, which is open, where you can just wrap your fingers around the handle? That would, of course, be quicker to draw, easier to carry, but it wouldn't have the same advantages in terms of stabilization, because now your wrist can move to an extent. Now, on a Katar, the side bars give you some stabilization when they rest against the forearm. If you have something like, for example, the wrist blade from Halo, that is actually just the handle itself, like a push dagger, basically. So the drawback of that is that, particularly if it's very long, which of course a normal push dagger isn't, then you've got all that leverage acting on your wrist. So it's possible to bend your wrist and overextend it, in a parry, or if your opponent deliberately grapples it or, binds it, strikes it, etc. And of course, that range of movement that you get takes away from the stabilization as well. If it wobbles around a little bit, it's not quite as strong. With the strap version, depending on how well done it is, it can also take away from the power of a thrust to an extent. If you think about how it's attached, just basically friction holds it in place on your arm. So with a very powerful thrust against a hard target, doesn't even have to be armor, it can be bone or whatever, there's something that pushes back, basically. If this isn't properly secured, it's going to want to move like this. It's going to take away from the force that you put into it. It's going to absorb it by shifting around. But you could find workarounds for that. Generally, if it's a rigid plate, like a steel vambrace, for example, if that's properly secured, then it shouldn't be as much of an issue, and you can always add an extra strap or grip here, because then you're actually holding onto it with your fist as well, like this. If this blade was actually solidly connected to the buckler, then I'd be able to push against the center grip of the buckler and really drive it in, and it wouldn't shift around. So this is an interesting question. Why wasn't this more common? You see spikes on shields sometimes, but they tend to be protruding out the front. And In some cases, they're not really intended as much for attacking. Like, they can be used like that, but in some cases, the idea is really more to catch an opponent's blade there and then manipulate it with that. But this form here is not really all that common. I can't say I've seen anything really. There might be a few here and there, but it's definitely not common. And that's kind of odd in a way, because this is quite useful. Of course, whenever you hold it like this, the blade doesn't do anything. So you would have to keep it in this position, which you often do anyway. There are guard positions where you put the buckler in front of you, then it doesn't make as much sense. But if you're actually using a strapped shield instead of a center grip shield, then you have another point of contact. I don't actually have a strapped shield, but I've got this nifty arm shield here that attaches to the arm via a bracer. And so just imagine there is a grip here that you can hold on to. And I don't have a push dagger, so welcome to improvisation town. So yeah, just assume that, or imagine that this is a straight blade sticking out. You've got an armored forearm right here, and you can punch with that, you can slash with it. This is actually really useful. I quite like this setup here. This could also be a spiked forearm shield, and this, in fact, there is precedent for, at least imagery. There's a picture of spiked arm shields that are exactly this, which are fantastic, in my opinion. This would be such a useful weapon. You have a lot of defensive options here. With that, it covers arguably more than a buckler. It doesn't have the same radius, but you've got more length to work with, and then you can attack with it more effectively as well. So this seems great to me. Why wasn't this more common in history? Honestly, I can't tell you. It could have to do with concerns like how easy it is to carry, but then again, carrying a buckler is not that much more convenient, I would argue. And if it's not actually tied to you as such, but if, like a heater shield, for example, there is a strap or two that you slip your arm through, and then a handle or strap that you hold onto, that would be fine. So this would be quite useful. Sure, this doesn't give you as much coverage as a larger shield, but nothing's stopping you from simply making it larger. In fact, I've seen fantasy designs where people took a heater shield and either put an edge on, or like an angled point, or outright spike or blade, etc., etc. And yeah, that's perfectly doable. As it turns out, this is not all that fantasy. There is the Hungarian Shield, which is sharply angled and typically terminates in a point which may or may not be useful for thrusting depending on the individual design. And by the way, if you really like this silly idea of dual wielding shields, not so silly anymore. 2 arm shields with spikes or with a longer blade or something like that, or dual wielding patas, that could definitely be feasible. And it's just cool. It's one of those weapons that just look awesome, you know, be it arm claws or blades or anything like that. And there are plenty of advantages to it, really, because if you combine this with a longer weapon, you know, either you hold a sword or whatever other weapon really in the main hand that has plenty of reach, or if you want just a longer wrist blade, and then you've got the shorter one with the arm shield in the offhand. So that way you'd have the reach, but if you get into grappling distance, now you also have a lot to work with, and you can, you know, throw hooks and do all kinds of neat things and grappling and all that while being perfectly protected. So what do you think? Do you like the concept? Do you hate it? Do you have any guesses for why spiked or bladed arm shields weren't that common? Or maybe you've seen some that I'm unaware of. Feel free to share, and hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and have a good one, folks.